Hello, everyone. This week, we're going to be concentrating on the cardiovascular system. Cardio, it means heart, and vascular means transport. So it actually tells you that the function of the system is transporting materials around the body. It's just important to our body as the interstate highway system, railways in the United States, the waterways. Where would we be without the ability to transport materials around the country? Same with the body. Well, what do we transport? Well, the heart, the blood vessels in the blood are responsible for transporting all those things you see on the list there. Oxygen, oxygen is you breathe it in, it goes across the walls of the air sacs of the lungs, which are just one cell thick, and into the capillaries that are in the lungs, and then into the major blood vessels around your body, and it's transported to every cell in your body. The oxygen goes into your mitochondria, and it's used to burn the food that you eat, to release its energy and make those wonderful ATPs and heat. Carbon dioxide is a product of that cellular respiration in the mitochondria, and that has to be removed from your body or else it could kill you. It's actually can be poisonous. So the carbon dioxide will leave the mitochondria, get into the bloodstream, travel back to the lungs, and then back into the air sacs, and then you breathe them out when you exhale. Digested food, well, when you eat something, obviously what you swallow is much too big to get into a cell, especially into a mitochondria within a cell. So what happens is that you have to break the food down into smaller particles. That's called digestion. And what you do is you're breaking the food down into particles so small that they could actually dissolve in your blood. And those materials are things like glucose, amino acids, things that you when you break down your food. That gets into your cells and into the mitochondria. And so you're actually bringing the fuel, which is the food, to the mitochondria to be burned with oxygen in cellular respiration, and that will give you energy. And then the carbon dioxide waste product is also put into your blood to be breathed out. Urea is a poison that's made when you eat proteins. Proteins are made of amino acids, and amino acids have amino groups on them. And when you use an amino acid for energy in the mitochondria, you have to remove that amino group. The amino group is a nitrogen-containing group. It's NH2. Your liver will take that NH2 and convert it to NH3, which is basically ammonia, and then into a less poisonous compound called urea. Urea will get into your bloodstream and be traveled to your kidneys. The kidneys will then remove the urea and it'll leave the body in your urine. Very important that you do that, or else the urea can build up in your body and kill you. So the blood vessels are responsible for transporting that urea, which you actually make from eating too much protein, and from the liver to, and then the kidneys will remove it for you. All your hormones are to your bloodstream for transport around your body. We'll have another whole week on hormones later on. But those are things like insulin and adrenaline and other hormones, which will go around your body and have lots and lots of effects. They have to be made in one place and used in another place. So therefore, they need to be transported. And they're transported in the blood, growth hormone, even the sex hormones. And they go to a target, and then they have an effect on the target in your body. Your blood is mostly made of water, which is important because water holds a lot of heat, and so it is able to, you can use your bloodstream to actually help control your body temperature. Antibodies are proteins that you make when you're sick, and the antibodies can actually stick onto the organism that's making you sick, whether it's a virus or a bacterium, and literally clump it up. And then your white blood cells can eat them while they're all clumped up and on the antibodies and made unable to hurt you. Cholesterol is a molecule that you need, but too much of it can clog up your blood vessels. You need cholesterol because it makes all your cell membranes fluid, so they can flow around the cell and fold into the cell to become the endoplasmic reticulum and other membrane or organelles. And cholesterol is also the source of your sex hormones as well, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Proteins are a whole various number of them, lots and lots of different proteins that are dissolved in your blood. Now, there's a few examples here. Albumin is there to make the percentage of water in your blood equal to the percentage of water in your cells. So there's not a problem with osmosis where water leaves the cells or go into cells too much. It's basically the same protein that's in egg white. Clotting factors are proteins that help you obviously clot your blood. We'll talk about that later. And then all those enzymes that control the chemical reactions that your body does, hundreds and hundreds of them that can do all different things for you. That's what's even just some of the things that are actually transported by your blood, and it shows you how important your blood is. Then we get to the next slide here. This is the way the blood flows around your body. This is a simple diagram just to show the way the blood flows. And what we'll do here is I'm going to use my pointer finger, and I'm going to start here at this where it says RA. RA stands for right atrium. Atrium is like an entryway. And you'll notice that in this area of the heart here, this side is the actual right side of the heart. So right atrium is that side. Is a dark gray color. And dark gray means low oxygen blood. That means the blood in here has very little oxygen in it, and it's already basically used up blood coming back to the body from the organs. When it gets into the right atrium, it goes through this valve here, and then the valve opens up and it goes down into the right ventricle. This is called the tricard valve. When the right ventricle squeezes and pushes, it bangs shut this valve, and the blood is forced up this tube here. This is called your pulmonary trunk. It's a large artery. Now you notice the blood is going away from the heart, and that's the definition of an artery. Artery takes blood away from the heart. It doesn't matter if it's low oxygen blood or high oxygen blood. As long as it's going away from the heart, it's an artery. You can see that's what's happening here. This is the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary means lungs. Then when it gets up here, you get to the right and left pulmonary arteries, and it takes the blood to the right lung or to the left lung so that the lung can take the carbon dioxide out and replace it with oxygen. And you notice now from the lungs, you have veins now that are taking the blood back to the left side of the heart. Veins are blood vessels that take blood toward the heart. It doesn't matter if it's good blood or bad blood or high oxygen or low oxygen blood. As long as it's going back to the heart, it's a vein. That's going to take the blood from the lungs, both of them, into the left atrium. The left atrium will squeeze, open this valve, which is called the mitral valve or bicuspid valve, and push the blood down into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle squeezes, it'll push the blood into this large blood vessel here, banging shut the mitral valve. In fact, banging shut these valves is really what your heartbeat is. And then this goes up into this blood vessel here. That's called your aorta. It's the largest blood vessel in the body, and that distributes the blood to everywhere it has to go, all throughout the whole body. There's many, many branches. Each branch is an artery name, and it takes you to all the organs there are. You get to all the cells in the body takes the oxygen out by putting it into the cells and into the mitochondria and replaces it with carbon dioxide. Now, the bad blood that the body has basically used up now is going to has to go back to the heart. And there's large blood vessels here that take the blood back to the right atrium where we started. And those are called vena cavae. Vena cava is singular, vena cavae is plural. And there are two of these, and we'll show you in the next slide what they are. These are very large veins that come back to the right atrium of your heart. Now, in the real body, the aorta here, this one, and the vena cava, they sit right next to each other in front of your backbone. One's taking blood back to the heart, and one's taking it away from the heart to the body. Now, the next slide will show you a heart and what it really looks like, and with some of these other structures that we'll see a lot clearer. This is a heart. It's kind of bent toward the left side a bit, and it's right in the middle of your chest, under your sternum, in a portion right in your lungs called the mediastinum. Now, let's look at this right atrium again. There's your right atrium right there. That's going to have low oxygen blood in it. That's going to squeeze and push the blood down into the right ventricle. The right ventricle valve here that's going to open and let that blood through is called a tricuspid valve. It's made of mostly tough connective tissue. On the bottom of the valve flaps, there's a large connective tissue sort of tendon, and they call it a chordae tendineae. And what that is it's connected to the bottom of the heart here and the bottom of the valves. And what that's going to do is when this ventricle here squeezes and pushes the blood up into the pulmonary trunk toward the lungs, that's going to make sure that these valve flaps don't flap too far back. And that's going to cause the blood to flow back into the atrium. We don't want that to happen. So these little heartstrings here, this chordae tendineae, they stop the valves from closing too far up. They just bang it shut. And that protects your life every single heartbeat. So those are the chordae tendineae. They stop the blood from flowing back up into the atrium when the ventricles beat. Now, if the valve does close properly and the chordae tendineae holds them nice and shut, what's going to happen is the blood will flow up here into the pulmonary trunk. Now, you notice in the pulmonary trunk, there's another little valve. And the reason that's there is because the heart is not a continuous pump. It pumps and then it rests. It pumps and then it rests. So in between pumps, the blood has a tendency to fall back into the heart. And this valve prevents that. This little valve is called a lunar valve. And what it does, it prevents the blood from falling back into the ventricle when the heart is resting. The blood will then flow into the right and left pulmonary artery and go to the lungs. When it gets to the lungs, it'll get rid of the CO2 and replace it with oxygen. The oxygen, bright red oxygen blood now will come back through these pulmonary veins back to the left atrium. There's pulmonary veins here on this side and pulmonary on this, and they will pour blood into the left atrium here. When blood has a lot of oxygen, it's bright red, and when it doesn't, it's kind of a maroon color. It's kind of a reddish, purplish red color. It would be purplish red on the right side because that's low oxygen blood on that side, and high oxygen blood here will be bright red. The atrium will squeeze, push the blood through this valve. This valve is the mitral or bicuspid valve. It'll open and let the blood flow into the left ventricle. And you notice the left ventricle has a little meat, a lot more muscle, so that when it squeezes, it's a lot stronger. Well, that has to push blood around the body, so that's probably why that is. The blood the ventricle will squeeze, banging shut the mitral valve. The chordae tendineae, again, will make sure the valve doesn't flow backwards. And then the blood will flow into the aorta. The aorta is the largest blood vessel in your body, highest blood pressure, and it also has a semilunar valve to protect the blood flowing back into the left ventricle when the heart is resting in between beats. And the aorta has lots and lots of branches. These branches would become carotid arteries, which go up to your head. And then as it goes down here, you'll notice it'll go down below the heart, all the way down to the bottom of your backbone. And as it goes down, there'll be branches of the aorta that go into all the various organs. And they have, all the artery names. When the blood gets into the organs and finally into the cells, around the cells, I should say, the oxygen leaves the blood and goes into the cells and into the mitochondria. The CO2 replaces it, so the blood becomes a darker maroon color. It's a low oxygen, high CO2 now. It will return to the heart through veins. The veins will all come together below the heart into this huge blood vessel here, the inferior vena cava. That's going to bring the blood back up to the right atrium. From the top part of your body here, the veins in your neck, like your jugular veins and so on, will coalesce and come together and form the superior vena cava. Remember, superior means above and inferior means below. The superior vena cava will return the blood again back to the right atrium from the top of your body. So the right atrium will receive the bad blood, and then we'll have to go through the whole cycle over again and over again and over again for the rest of your life. The atrium will push the blood into the ventricle, the right side. The ventricle will push it up into the lungs. The lungs will push it back into the left side. It'll go into the left ventricle and then around the body again and then back to the right atrium. It just happens over again and over again and over again. Now, this is a picture of an actual heart, and you can see some of the structures here. Here's the carotid arteries that branch off of the aorta. This is the right ventricle and the left ventricle. This is the outside of an atrium. So you can see some of the things in a real heart. Now, what's covering the heart is a thing called a pericardium. Peri means around, and again, cardio means heart. And what it is, it's two membranes made of mostly connective tissue. It's a tough membrane, kind of like plastic wrap. The visceral pericardium is right next to the heart and actually touches it. It's like putting the heart into a plastic bag. And then you have a larger plastic bag or larger covering called a parietal pericardium. And then you put that small plastic bag that around the heart into the larger plastic bag, the parietal one. So you basically have the heart in two plastic bags, an inside one and an outside one. In between the two of them is a thick, oily fluid called serous fluid that fills the space between the two layers. You have a visceral pericardium touching the heart, and then you have that serous fluid, and then the outer parietal pericardium membrane. And when the heart beats, then it's kind of cushioned by that fluid, and it protects the heart from wearing itself out as you age. Now, when the atria beat, the two of them, the right and left one, beat simultaneously at the same time, because the impulse that shoots through the heart goes very, very fast because of those special connections between the heart cells called intercalary discs. When the atria contract, they push the blood down into the ventricles, and when they contract, you get the higher blood pressure number, because when the ventricles are contracting, they're pushing the blood around the body, and that increases the pressure in your arteries. When the ventricles are in between contractions and they're resting, then obviously the blood pressure in the arteries go down. And so that's why blood pressure has two numbers, 120/80, they call it. And that's the normal blood pressure for people. When the heart is actually beating, the two ventricles are beating and pushing blood around the body, that's the systole. And we call that the systolic blood pressure. That's the high number. When the ventricles are relaxing, that's the diastole, and that's the lower blood pressure number. The units are very archaic. It's called millimeters of mercury, 120 millimeters of mercury and 80 millimeters of mercury, because that's the old machine they used to use to measure blood pressure. And we still use the same units, but we don't use that machine anymore. Now we get to this slide here. This is kind of interesting. This is the way the heart controls itself with, considering the nervous system within it. What happens is that from the brain, you have a nerve that goes into the right atrium of the heart. It has a synapse here, a little space, and neurotransmitters go across the synapse and stimulate the nerves in this portion of the heart, right there in the right atrium. They call that the pacemaker or the sinoatrial node. It's really just a bundle of nerve cells. It gets the message from the brain, and it's one of the cranial nerves that comes down from the brain. It will send a message to the heart to beat. And what's going to happen is that'll create a wave of signal, basically sodium and potassium going in and out of the membranes, just like last week we talked about that. And that goes across the atria, the two of them. And when that happens, this is it happening right here. What's happening is that you get this little bump in the EKG. Now we're calling that an ECG because C means cardio, and they use a K sometimes for a foreign language. I think it's German for cardio, but it's still the same thing. So when you get this first little bump here, the doctor will look at that when you're hooked up to the EKG machine, and that would be the atria, these atria getting the signals to contract. But we don't want the ventricles to contract yet, because the last thing we want to do is have all four of these chambers squeezing at the same time, and of course that would be a mess. So there has to be a delay. So right here in between the two atria, right in that little spot right there, is called the bundle of His, H-I-S, right in there. That receives the message from the two atria, but a split second later. That's called the AV node of nerve cells because it's between the atria and the ventricles. And it sends the message down through these thick um, nerves actually down into the meat of the ventricles. Because there's a delay here, that gives the blood time to flow down into the ventricles before they squeeze. And that prevents all four of them from happening at the same time. And when the ventricles get the message, then what's going to happen is they'll get the blood in, these valves will open and the blood will go into the ventricles. And then the ventricle will finally, once the blood gets in there, because of the delay caused by the bundle of His in the AV node here, the ventricles will then squeeze and you'll get the blood flowing around the body. And that's this big spike that you see here in the EKG. That's when the ventricles are squeezing. Now, what the doctors are looking for is the shapes of the spikes, the height of the spikes, the shape of this little one about the atria here. It'll tell the doctor a lot about whether you have atrial fibrillation or whatever else might be going wrong with the heart. This last one is called your T wave. And what that is just the cells of the heart going back to normal, the sodium potassium pump, putting all the sodium molecules, ions back into outside the cell and the potassium back inside the cell. So this is basically just sort of getting it back to normal before it can do the next beat. Remember, muscles work just like nerves. And so when a wave of signal goes through a muscle or an impulse, it's the same thing. It's in the cells of the muscle, sodium goes in, potassium goes out, and then the sodium potassium pump reverses that and puts it back where they were, just like it does in that we talked about last week. And we're reflecting that in this EKG here. Next slide here, we'll be talking about the EKG itself. You see the P wave is the atria beating, and then the QRS wave is the ventricles beating, and this is the recovery phase. Normal heartbeat is about 72 beats per minute for an average person. Now, as far as the blood vessels go, remember, arteries take blood away from the heart. Easy way to remember that is arteries start with A, and away starts with A. So arteries away. Arteries also have thicker walls. And the reason for that is because they have higher blood pressure. You don't want the arteries to pop on you. And when the arteries take the blood away from the heart, they branch into smaller arteries heading toward organs. And then inside the organ, there's a network of capillaries. Now, capillaries are only one cell thick epithelium. Very, very, very thin. And so small that you wouldn't be able to even see them without a microscope. If this was real, you wouldn't be able to see these the way they are here. They're drawn way too big. But you had to do that for so you can see them. As the blood flows through the capillaries, that's when the exchange takes place. The oxygen goes from the blood into the cells of the organ, and it's replaced with CO2 and other poisons. And also the digested food goes into the cells as well. So this capillary network is extensive inside all your organs. And what's happening is that's where the exchange, that's where the blood is giving to the organs what the organs need and taking from the organs waste. And then as the blood flows through the capillaries, they start to coalesce back together again to form small veins. The small veins will then come together to form bigger veins, and they'll end up in the vena cava, and that'll send the blood back up to the heart. Now, a problem here is that when the blood goes through the capillaries, it loses a lot of its pressure because of all that friction in there. So what happens is that by the time it gets into the veins, the pressure is very low. When you measure your blood pressure, it's always in an artery. So what's happening is that it's the blood, especially below your heart, would have trouble getting back to the heart. So inside of all your veins, unlike arteries, there's one-way valves. And you see this one-way valve here. So when you squeeze a vein, and you do that every time you breathe or move a muscle, move your body in any way, even just twitching, you will squeeze the blood back to the heart. So they call it milking veins. And that's important because that's a very important way to get the blood back to the heart, along with the small amount of pressure that's in there to push the blood back that way. So you do milk your veins to help you out. That's why when you move, you feel less tired. because you actually are improving your circulation. You're pushing the blood in the veins back to the heart better. Otherwise, sometimes the blood actually pools in your legs and causes things like varicose veins and things like that. And we get to the next slide here. You can see this is my diagram of the blood vessels. And you see the arteries have much, much thicker walls. There's outer wall, which is called the tunica externa, or outer coat. And that's all thick connective tissue. And you don't want this to pop, so it's kind of strong. And then you have the smooth muscle below that, and that causes your pulse. That's also pushing the blood along, as well as your heart is. And then it's lined with epithelium, nice and smooth. All right. And then in a vein, you can see the veins have much thinner walls because they don't have as much pressure inside them. The same 3 layers. But the veins also have one-way valves in them, which is not shown in the diagram here. But they do have to be there because when you push a vein, when you squeeze it with a muscle in your body, when you twitch a leg or walk or anything like that, or just get up from a chair, whatever, you're pushing the blood back to the heart because of the one-way valves in the veins. The capillaries form the 99.999% of all your blood vessels. In fact, believe it or not, if you take all your capillaries, which are only 1 cell thick epithelium and microscopically small, blood cells have to go through capillaries 1 cell at a time to give the oxygen to the cells or whatever, and do their transport and their transfer, actually, of things from the blood to the cells. If you look at all the capillaries and arteries and veins and put them into a straight line, in an average person, it's, believe it or not, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 miles long. That's enough to go around the earth for about 4 or 5 times. It's just crazy. That's how many blood vessels you have in your body. If you took your hand and put it in some kind of special acid that would dissolve everything except blood vessels, and you pulled it out, you would still see your hand and blood vessels. That's how thick they are inside. They're so packed in there like that, especially the capillaries. Now we go to the next slide. This is a picture of you actually milking a vein. And when you do that with your skeletal muscles in your legs or in your body, you will see that you push the vein, and that pushes the blood back to the heart because of the one-way valves. The next slide, you see a capillary network. Now, this is a capillary network that might, say, appear in your dermis of your skin. So what's happening here is that when you are very, very warm, you're going to want to lose some heat. So what that's going to do is going to open all these little muscles here. These little guys are called precapillary sphincters. As the artery goes and becomes capillaries in your skin, there's little muscles that can open and close here. And that can let more or less blood flow through these capillaries. If you're very warm, you want to open these all up so your skin will actually get a little reddish. And because the blood is carrying heat, it moves the heat through your skin into the cooler air around your body. And therefore, your body will cool off. If you are very cold, you're going to want to close these valves. So very little blood flows through your skin, just enough to keep the cells alive. And most of the blood is shunted deeper into your body to keep it away from the cold air so that you cannot freeze to death. If you drink alcohol, a lot of people think that if you drink alcohol, it's a good thing to warm up. The problem with that is that's a fine idea as long as you're inside somebody's house where it's nice and warm. But if you're outside in the ice cold air, what the alcohol does, it relaxes these muscles. So it actually opens up the blood vessels. That's why a lot of people, their face gets red when they drink. And a lot of the blood on the skin when it shouldn't be, especially it's cold outside. And that'll lose so much heat that you'll actually get colder than you were before you took the drink. So that could be a problem. Now, these are the blood cells. Now, you have red blood cells and white blood cells and what they call platelets. Those are the 3 types of blood cells. A red blood cell, it looks like a little disc or a frisbee. In fact, it looks like a poker chip, really. They're called erythrocytes. Erythro is a prefix that means red, and cyte means cell. So it really just means red cells. They are flat, and the reason they're flat is because that means that all the oxygen inside here is near the membrane, which means it makes it easier to get it out of the cell and into the body cells. You have a lot of red blood cells. You got about 5 million of them in a cubic millimeter of blood. A cubic millimeter is very small amount. It's much, 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 much less than a drop. And you have 5 million in that, just a little teeny bit. The only function that the red blood cells really have for you, they have no nuclei. A lot of the organelles aren't in there. They're just basically bags of a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is red, and its function is to be a magnet for oxygen atoms. And so what happens is that when you breathe, the oxygen goes into the blood, and because of the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, the oxygen goes into your red blood cells and attaches to the hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin will take the oxygen around your body. If you didn't have the hemoglobin and just dissolve the oxygen in your blood just as oxygen, you'd only be able to take about maybe 20th or 1/30th the amount of oxygen around your body per minute, and that wouldn't be enough to keep you alive. So you need the hemoglobin in the cells to be able to carry the oxygen to the cells for you. They only live for about 3 months, so you are constantly replacing your red blood cells with new ones made in your red bone marrow. The old ones are destroyed by your liver, and a brown material from your liver called bile contains the remnants of your dead red blood cells, and that's poured into your intestines, and so your body can get rid of it. And so that's why the feces of humans is always brown, or should be brown, because of the presence of the breakdown products of your dead red blood cells that your liver has created when it destroyed the older and dying red blood cells, and put that material, that brownish material, into the bile, which goes into your intestine and stains everything from that point in your intestine down brown, including your poop. So you're actually pooping out the molecules that are remaining from your dead red blood cells that your liver has destroyed. So you're always replacing them. Every 3 months, you have all new blood cells. In the next slide, this is what they look like in color. You can see they're just little red discs. White blood cells, now we're going to talk about them later on. This has to do with your immune system, and that's not in today's lesson. But just know that you don't have to know all the names today, but just that white blood cells are involved in your immunity. What they can do is they can eat like little amoebas. They go around eating things that aren't you and keep your body clean. If they notice that something is in your body, a bacterium or virus or whatever that is not part of your own body, it can actually consume and digest them away. Those are the white blood cells. And as you can see, there's many kinds of white blood cells, and we'll talk about those later on when we talk about immunity. There are only about 7,000 per cubic millimeter, so it's not anywhere near the number that the red blood cells are. And their function, again, is to keep you from either getting sick or make you able to get better when you are sick. Now, the platelets here, they're very small, actually pieces of cells, which actually are there to help you clot your blood. If your platelets aren't there, you would not be able to clot your blood when you have a cut. Thrombo means clot. So the name for a platelet is a thrombocyte. The name for a white blood cell is a leukocyte, because leuko means clear. And so that means of clear cells, which are cells that don't have that red color like red blood cells do. The platelets are thrombocytes, which means that they're involved in blood clotting. Okay. And this is how your blood clots. First, you have an injury to a blood cell. Obviously, it's starting to leak blood. And what's going to happen there is that the blood's going to start to come out. The platelets are going to they're going to stick to the area where the blood vessel is broken and create a little plug there to help stop the bleeding. But that's not going to be enough. It's still going to be bleeding there. So they start the process. And then what happens is in your plasma, the liquid portion of your blood that everything's flowing in, you have lots of proteins and also calcium ions, and you know how important they are, and a vitamin called vitamin K. And they all work together to change a protein that's in your plasma that's floating around in your body all the time. This protein is called prothrombin, and it's floating around in your blood right now. But when you have a cut, the plasma has proteins and calcium and vitamin K and other things that change the prothrombin into thrombin. And once the thrombin is present, it will change another protein that's floating around in your body called fibrinogen into fibrin. And the fibrin is are fibers that will actually clog up where the cut is and stop the bleeding. And that'll be your blood clot. So it takes a couple of minutes, especially in a small cut. And what happens is that basically your platelets form a little plug, and then your proteins and calcium and vitamin K change prothrombin to thrombin in the area, and then the thrombin changes your fibrinogen to fibrin, and the fibrin blocks the blood from coming out, and you are not going to bleed to death. If you miss any of these proteins in here, you have hemophilia, and you will not be able to clot your blood, and even the littlest cut would just keep dripping. Okay, now the last one for today is blood typing. We're going to talk a little bit about blood typing. Blood types are just identification proteins that exist on the outside of your red blood cells. They don't really do anything. They just identify the cells as cells that your immune system will recognize as yours or not yours. That's all they are. They're like a sign on a building. It just tells you what it is. Some people have a protein called A on their outside of their red blood cells. Some people have a protein that's slightly different called B. Some people have both A and B on their red blood cells, and some people have neither one. And neither one, of course, is zero, so we call that one type O. Now remember, you have two parents. Each parent gives you a gene to make this protein. So if you are a person who got a type A gene from mom and a type A gene from dad, then you would be AA. You'd have all your proteins would be just A. You got them from both parents. And so you'd be a perfect type A person. If you got a B gene from mom and a B gene from dad, you'd be a type B person. If you got an A gene from mom and a B gene from dad, if that happened, then you'd make the A protein and the B protein on your red blood cells for identification, and they would be your AB type. If your mom and dad have a mutated gene for blood type, in other words, it doesn't work in this case, they call that a recessive gene. And what would happen is that if you got a recessive gene like that from mom and a recessive gene like that from dad, you will not make A protein or B protein. You would get two genes like that from both parents. So what would happen is that you would be type O. Okay. Now, if you're type A, you can't take type B blood, because if you get A cells into your body, then what will happen is that your immune system, if you're type A and they get B cells into your body, your immune system will look at those B cells and say, that's not me, and clump them up with antibodies, anti-A antibodies, and destroy them. And then it would clog up your blood vessels and kill you. So getting a transfusion of the wrong blood type will cause your immune system to actually kill you. It's kind of interesting that way. So if you're a B person and you were receiving A blood by mistake, notice B people have anti-A antibodies in them, and you got A blood by mistake, those antibodies will just clump up those A blood cells and just clog up your whole bloodstream, and that'll be the end of you. Now, if you are a type O, you don't have A or B on your blood cells, which means that you can give O blood cells to anybody, because there's nothing there for your immune system to recognize. So what happens is that if you give somebody an O, you can be sure that they will accept it, because you will not make it. You can't make antibodies against some protein that isn't there. So O blood is the universal donor. If you're AB, that means your immune system thinks you're A, and your immune system also thinks you're B. So that means you're the universal recipient. You can receive A blood or B blood, and anybody can receive O blood. So you can receive any kind of blood. So AB is the universal recipient, and O is the universal donor. Now, one last thing. There's another protein that either exists or doesn't exist on your red blood cells. They call it the RH protein. If you have it, you're called RH positive. If you don't have it, then you're RH negative. So if you're an A person and you have the Rh protein also on your red blood cells, then you're A positive. If you're an A person and you don't have the Rh protein on there, then you're A negative. That's what the positive and negative signs mean. Okay, that's all that means. If you're a woman who's negative and has a positive baby growing inside of her, that could be a problem because the baby's blood can leak into your body if there's a rip in the placenta or something like that, and cause your body to react against it because you're a negative person. If you're a negative woman, the baby's positive blood goes into your bloodstream. Your immune system sees the positive blood that isn't yours and reacts against it and makes antibodies against it and clumps it up. And if any of those antibodies gets into the baby's blood itself, into the baby's body, they'll clump up his blood. And so they call that Rh incompatibility. It only happens if the woman happens to have a positive baby inside of her because her husband was positive. Okay. The next slide is just going to give you a list of what's actually floating around in the plasma. And we already talked about this on the first slide. It's a straw-colored solution. It looks like, actually looks a lot like urine. And the red blood cells float in there. That's why the blood looks red. It's the red blood cells that you see. And plasma is mostly water, and it has all those things that you see dissolved in it. Dissolved gases would be things like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Ions would be calcium and sodium and potassium and magnesium and so on. The nutrients would be the digested food that you have floating around inside your blood. The urea we talked about is poison that you make from eating too many proteins. And the proteins themselves could be antibodies, they could be enzymes, whatever. They could be clotting factors for making blood clots. All many different types of proteins are floating around in your blood. Okay, that's all for today. What we need for the cardiovascular system for this week. There'll be one assignment for this week on the cardiovascular system to hand in. And remember, we're getting near the end now, so don't slack off. Just keep going until we reach the end and the beginning of this paper. The paper should be, you should start on that pretty soon because it's due in about 2 weeks. Okay. See you next time around.